session. So turning to our panelists, apologies, Massimo, if I was cut off introducing you. I'm sure Pam did a great job taking over that role. But in terms of the article that you wrote in the Daily Maverick on 22nd April, that raised some really important debates on price regulation and the use of competition policy instruments like excessive pricing provisions during times of crisis. What are some of the basic economic principles underpinning price regulation and excessive pricing? And what are some of the challenges and the benefits of the different instruments that we have at our proposal to deal with pricing in exceptional circumstances? It would also be very interesting to hear how other countries are approaching this issue.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure to be in South Africa today, even while staying in my place in Barcelona. So coming to your question, Reena, I think that the starting point is that price regulation and excessive prices is something that we should resort to only when there are circumstances in which markets would not function properly. And I think this is the case with the COVID crisis. In particular, what is happening here is that most of the high price problems come from situations of excess demand. So what happens is there are excess demand of some particular products, like, for instance, face masks and hand sanitizers and ventilators, etc. So this is pushing the prices up to levels which are not socially acceptable, and hence the temptation to intervene so as to impose the price caps. So, as I said, the premise is that to some extent, or to a smaller or greater extent, what happens is that the markets would not function properly, would take too much time. But I think, by and large, I think I would try to separate the cases in which the supply is not responsive at all from the case in which a supply is responsive, even if not immediately and not perfectly. And I think that if the supply is responsive, at least to some degree, then if you let the price increase, you would encourage more production, and at least to some degree, you would be able to relax this problem of excess demand. Which means also that these are the cases in which it might be more problematic to use price regulation or other forms of price caps, such as excessive pricing actions in antitrust. If the supply is not responsive and the problem that you have is a problem of excess demand, then I think that the price regulation is less problematic, because in the counterfactual, production would not increase anyway. So I think this is a distinction that I would like to make in the first place. So I think there is the case for using price regulation of some sort. I think is stronger when you can perceive that the supply is not responsive. However, it should be clear that price regulation does not solve the problem, because the excess demand would still be there. And in particular, there should be some way to deal with the issue of how you allocate the scarce production to the demand. So I think when there is a price regulation, there is also, importantly, there should also be an intervention in terms of how to ration the production, how to allocate the available production. In this particular case, for instance, I think it's fundamental that priority should be given to healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, people working with the public. I think that's should be the absolute priority. There are also other cases. I do not know whether maybe James is going later on to talk about such cases which are more related to food and problems that is in which it's not really an issue of excess demand, which is going to push the prices up, but really the fact that there is much less competition because people cannot shop around, and then even firms and even retailers that in normal times would not have market power suddenly have the possibility to increase prices. In terms of what are the instruments in which you can actually approach the issues, and what other countries are doing, well, you know, there are, I do not know how many countries in the world, upwards of 150, and also there are some countries where you have different instruments at the level of different states. So some are using consumer protection provisions. You reminded us that also this is can be done also in South Africa. Others have anti-price gouging regulations, or you can also introduce ad hoc provisions in emergency laws, etc. So the panorama is quite broad here. In the case of the COVID crisis, the case which I know better, which is Europe, there has not been much intervention. It's pretty isolated, and on some particular countries, they have used some sort of price regulation on some limited products which are considered essentials, and in particular, again, face mask. I think it's the example which is more recurrent. Here, it's interesting that you know, I live in Spain, but being Italian, I read Italian newspapers every day, and Italian newspapers are mentioning these days that there has been a series of difficulties which have been created by a price cap which has been introduced by the government a few days ago. The government has introduced a price regulation whereby surgical face masks cannot be sold at a price which is higher than 50 cents of a euro, which I think is about 8-10 rand. And so this has created lots of problems, because what was happening before that is that given that the price of face mask was increasing, there are lots of firms in textile and clothing industries which have started to reconvert production to start and sell face masks. And suddenly they see that the price that the government is putting is too low for them to be able to recover costs. And so apparently, I don't have first-hand information, just from what the newspapers are saying, apparently many of these firms have simply abandoned you know, the plans of reconverting production. And also, it looks like you know, there has been face masks disappearing from pharmacies, and supermarket chains have withdrawn masks that previously had for sale. So this is just an anecdote which shows the possible problems that you might have with price regulation in a situation in which, at least to some extent, or at least from this particular country, the supply could have been more responsive. In terms, again, and I conclude, in terms of what are the different instruments that you can use. Well, we have mentioned several, you know, straight price regulation, excessive prices, etc. But and I guess that the more on this issue will be discussed later on. But I would like to mention something else, that is that at least for those productions in which there is some responsiveness, I think that the governments should also intervene in a different way. So, for instance, by subsidizing production, or even better, to introduce something like a guaranteed purchase price, so that firms would know that if they are reconverting production, then for at least for a certain period of time, they know that they can sell at a certain price without having the uncertainty of you know, reconverting the production, and by the time the plant has been reconverted, what has happened is that the prices have dropped, and therefore it's not convenient anymore. And with this, I would close with these introductory remarks. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Massimo. I mean, you've raised some really important issues about the certainties that firms need in these times, and you've given us examples of how governments have tried to provide firms a little with more certainty, including through guarantee purchase price. I'm sure there'll be many questions from the attendees at the time of the Q&A, but I'd like to move to Pamela next. Pamela, the excessive pricing provisions in South Africa have long been very, very hotly contested. Do some of the key areas of debate that have arisen in the past cases in South Africa, such as in the Mittal Steel case, for example, or the Sasol Chemical Industries case, apply at all in this COVID-19 situation? And these are the kind of the questions around dominance, around economic value, measuring economic value, and the treatment of special cost advantages.
Good afternoon, everyone. These economic debates, Reena, particularly those relating to dominance, economic value, and special cost advantages, indeed have been highly contested, and there have been hundreds of pages of economic expert reports dealing with these particular subjects, and some of the cases taking up to 8 years to show just how complex those debates have been. But I think what we can focus on is that the previous South African cases have advanced thinking in economic debates in excessive pricing analysis. And we certainly see that the lessons from the previous cases have informed the recent amendments to the Act, which is in hope to make the analysis a little bit easier. And for me, one of the key lessons that we can draw from the previous cases is that context matters in these deliberations, and the economic analysis needs to take this into account. Now, the previous cases you referred to, Mittal as well as Sasol Chemical Industries, the context of those cases would differ quite substantially to the kind of cases that we see and we expect to see in regulations. So the previous cases emphasize, for instance, the role of industrial policy in affecting market outcomes, including creating and entrenching market dominance. And you see how this has now come into the kind of factors that you need to consider when you are determining whether or not a price is excessive. So the new Section 8.3e of the Act now notes that past and current advantages that are due to direct and indirect state support are relevant factor for considering the analysis of excessive pricing. And that particular point is at the heart of the debates around special cost advantages. Now, in COVID-19 cases, that is highly unlikely to arise. These are not the kind of industries, heavy manufacturing industries that were built on the back of infant industry, industrial support. And that's exactly what you saw in Mittal, exactly what you saw in Sasol. These markets are very different. They're markets of essential goods, and which are typically consumer goods, and they've benefited far less from state support. So I think that's one of the key differences. However, if we think about kind of context that matters in this instance, I think the role of economics in understanding geographic markets plays a big part. The pandemic, including the lockdown and other social distancing regulations, imply narrower and more local markets than you would have defined in the previous period, and definitely in the previous cases, which typically related to national markets. The crisis, by its very nature, and the responses to the crisis change the chain of substitution. And this, of course, relates very much to the analysis of dominance. And it's not just about the economic geography that differs slightly. I mean, there's potential that there can be a finding of dominance that entails temporary dominance. And this is quite different from the kind of analysis that we saw in the previous cases. We were talking about entrenched dominance that had endured for long periods of time. But the idea of temporary dominance is not new to competition economics. And in fact, there's been a finding of temporary dominance due to a crisis that was previously found by the European Commission in the ABG oil case. Here, the European Commission found that oil companies during an oil shortage, this was in the 1970s, were temporarily dominant because their customers were completely dependent on them for scarce products. And given the shortages, the companies were unable to compete with each other by supplying their rival customers. And you can see that there's some similarities with what we are seeing under the COVID-19 market conditions. And I mean, I think other issues that are likely to come up or may potentially be debated now that were not relevant in the previous cases were around the concept of collective dominance. And I mean, I think this is going back to a previous point that both in Sasol and Mittal, we were talking about super dominance, market that had high market shares and that had endured market power over long periods of time. So now you can actually talk about the concept of collective dominance due to the changes in the marketplace. And then I think a last point around dominance may be that I think there may be more emphasis now on defining dominance simply on the mere ability of a firm to substantially increase prices above competitive level. This was debated in the previous cases, but was not the center of the analysis. And then when it comes to value, there have been some changes in the Competition Act. Right, and I mean, I think this is where now the kind of debates about what is competitive benchmark, what is, in the language of the previous act, what is economic value, is no longer relevant, as the concept of economic value altogether has been deleted from the act. The new definition of excessive pricing talks about a price that would be alleged to be excessive relative to a competitive price. And the Act provides a non-exhaustive list of factors that may be considered in the assessment, in this assessment. And when you look at that list, they draw substantially from the previous cases, but also from international precedents such as the United Brands case. I mean, looking at the kind of comparators that are listed here and thinking about the COVID-19 type issues, I mean, I would just say that caution needs to be exercised in some of the comparators. And for example, if you look at the comparator based on historical prices of the dominant firm, if you think about, seasonal discounting that happens, and this happens a lot in the early part of the year. So when a company then reverts to their old prices, it may seem like they're increasing their prices, but this, is just really the ending of a discount period. I mean, I don't think that these are the types of issues that the Commission is looking at, and it is quite fairly straightforward to be able to verify this is indeed what happened and not an exploitative conduct. And there are various evidence, and I'm sure the Commission may speak to this at some point. You could look at price movements in previous year that would reflect your seasonal discounting. You could look at marketing strategies. You could look at promotional material that would let you know whether or not there was indeed a price discount in the period prior to 1st of March 2020. Another comparator that was used in the previous cases that I'd say here needs to be engaged with a bit of caution is the one of prices of comparator firms. So I think the ability of firms during a crisis, any crisis, and even in this crisis, to respond to the crisis differs quite significantly. Some firms would elect to absorb the higher price costs that would have come to whatever supply shocks to increase surge costs. And indeed, we've seen actually in the United States in price gouging cases where one of the firms indicated that as a corporate social responsibility initiative, they would absorb all the increased costs and not pass on to the customers. So now when you are undertaking your excessive pricing analysis and you're comparing the price of one firm to another, and the one firm decided to absorb the costs and the other didn't, you need to be cognizant of that and take this into account so as not to bias the analysis. But of course, I mean, this does not differ substantially from the key principles of comparative firm prices, which is that you really need to ensure that the price that you are using as a benchmark is indeed comparable to the price of to the market conditions, that the respondent firm faces. So I think I will end the kind of differences that I see between the old and the new cases there. But I think something that's also interesting is the Sasol Chemical Industries case introduced the concept of preponderance of evidence, which was that various tests had to be conducted and the majority of them have to converge in order to find and for a successful finding of excessive pricing. And now with the changes, also with the onus of the burden of proof on excessive pricing, it's going to be quite interesting to see how the competition authorities as well as the respondents engage with that.
Thanks very much, Pam. One of the things that strikes me from what you've said is around the importance of context, and that context matters when looking at the different factors that need to be taken into account in an excessive pricing case. So it'll be interesting to hear from both Nicola and James on that. But moving on to you, Nicola, your firm FTI Consulting has acted for respondents in excessive pricing cases in this period. What are the most important economic aspects that these cases highlight? It seems that some of the cases deal with firms that would not under normal circumstances have market power. So this was the comment I had at the beginning. For example, SMEs are now finding themselves potentially on the wrong side of the law. How are we to think about issues of market power and market definition under these new regulations?
Thanks, Reena. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be part of this webinar. These are obviously fascinating issues, I think, both from an academic perspective, but also from a practical perspective. James and the Commission has to deal with these under an expedited time frame. I think we are all in a new world. The world around us changed, and on the 19th of March, we got this new customer regulations. The problem is that these regulations obviously speak to what we already have under the amended Act. So we still have to think in terms of Section 8.1a. And I think the main problem from an economic point of view is we are all trained to think about market power and excessive pricing as something which is enduring and the result of some form of market power and entrenched market power. So the cases that Pamela referred to, I think we are all familiar with these, Sasol, Mittal, some of the international cases. But we effectively have to think anew about these issues. We now have new regulations, and I think the issue I really want to talk about briefly, which we experienced also in the first case that was heard before the tribunal. I don't want to go into the specifics of the case, but it was mainly about face masks. And the interesting question that we have to deal with under these new regulations, as Pamela and Reena also pointed out, is that essentially we are talking about consumer goods. So when one normally thinks about price signals, increasing production, these people are in fact resellers. So I think that's important to distinguish that from previous cases like Sasol and Mittal that were actually producing goods. What is happening at the moment is that we still have the requirement that a firm must be dominant and must have market power in order to be prosecuted for excessive pricing, even under the regs. So that then immediately brings you to a situation where you visibly see the price increase, you see that consumers pay more, and you have to decide what to do about this. But immediately, when you want to apply Section 7 of the Competition Act in order to try and establish dominance and market power, you are then faced with a problem that in economics we think about market power as enduring, as I've already said, but also typically a firm with a small market power, let's say 10% or 15%, normally aren't thought of as having market power. But often in these cases now, you would sit with an SME, a small firm that's a reseller of, let's say, face masks, and you then have to think analytically about whether this firm actually has market power and can be found guilty of abusing that market power. Now, if you don't go the market share route, and this we've seen in the cases that have been prosecuted to date, then you have to establish dominance and market power under the section under 7, which says that it is the ability to act to an appreciable extent independently of customers, competitors, or suppliers. So the question for me from a theoretical point of view is, can I establish dominance and market power without defining a market? We know that that can be done. It has been done in some cases. There's a lot of academic literature that says in abuse cases it might be possible to determine market power just based on behavior and not defining a relevant market. But I see that as very problematic because what you're doing is you are moving away from your analytical framework for defining relevant markets, both product and geographic market. Now, we also see that there's a list of essential goods published under these regulations, and we understand the rationale for these. When one thinks about medical supply, hygiene product, PPEs, ventilators, these are obviously things that you want to be available at a competitive price. But the problem is, if you don't define a relevant market, you miss some of the product attributes. For instance, you want to perhaps police the pricing of dust masks, which is not necessarily used for medical purposes. And that to me is the danger of not defining a relevant market. So you are moving in a space where you want to see whether this firm can act independently. You think that the fact that they were able to increase the price potentially would give them market power and potentially temporary market power, but you skip the step where you have to think in a consistent fashion about what the market looks like. I also just want to briefly touch then on geographic market, because there's a lot of talk about geographic market being limited in a crisis. That might be correct, but I think we should also be very specific about the facts of a specific case. So typically it is intuitively appealing to think that if there's a COVID-19 crisis, my local supermarket gets market power. But is that actually the case? For instance, in a face mask, is it the case if I can shop online? So all of these things happen within a specific framework, but it doesn't mean that we can disregard our typical analytical economic tests, or very specifically also the facts of the case. So yes, as Pamela also mentioned, search costs might be higher, transaction costs might be higher, but it really depends on the product. And that's why we can't, in my mind, skip the prior step of defining the relevant product market. Linked to that is the point that Massimo also touched on, and that is the supply response. So what we see at the moment is a lot of attention on these masks, on these markets, and a lot of time and effort being spent to prosecute firms, where I think one should think very carefully about the period, both in terms of the market power, if you think about temporary market power, but also the supply response. So again, economics tells us that if the supply response is likely, if it's timely, if it's efficient, then the reason or the rationale for intervention or price regulation really disappears, because the market in fact corrects itself. And I don't want to talk about colloquial examples, but everybody knows that face masks now can be obtained really anywhere. So there was a very quick response to that specific increase in price. And I would argue that that is the type of market where there was a correction, because the supply immediately increased, and one then has to think about whether the intervention period is short, can be based on, for instance, a month period. So there are issues here raised again in terms of the period. So we understand it's from the beginning of March we have these, so it's from the 19th of March. But if you want to apply the test under the regulations, it says that you have to look at the prior 3 months. So again, when we think as economists, we think typically about market power or pricing over a long run period, perhaps 12 months. And here you've got the added unfortunate problem that the prior 3 months would often include seasonal price promotions, for instance, over the December or the Christmas period. So while I understand the rationale for some retrospective comparison, I'm not sure that those 3 months would be the right comparison. And then, of course, there's this whole issue of the competitive price. So we know under our Amendment Act now, we have to think about the competitive price. That's also part of the two-step process internationally. But the problem, again, is that in this case of consumer goods, everybody increased their price for a period. And often these products were imported. So in fact, the cost also increased, but often there was a timing issue because you were ordering the face masks from overseas. You knew that the price would increase, potentially also based on the exchange rate depreciation. But if you put up your prices, you would get a big difference between your price cost on specific days, but that high margin would effectively be eliminated over the period when you receive your new goods at the increased price. So the combination of these issues makes these things very complicated. I think in principle, one should be concerned about price gouging in this time. One should be concerned about high prices, which is the result of market power. But it will be very, very difficult, and I don't envy the Commission, but it's very difficult in these circumstances to distinguish between the cases that should generally be prosecuted and those potentially where intervention would actually lead to a misallocation of scarce resources. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nicola. Some really interesting questions around the importance to define product and geographic markets, particularly, I guess, geographic markets in this time, and how to deal with supply responses, as you said, where prices for certain products have gone up and we've seen a increase in supply of things like face masks. So all very interesting questions, and I hope we can engage a little bit more in discussions with some of the questions coming from the attendees, and perhaps James can also touch on some of these. But moving on to you, James, we're already seeing settlements concluded with some firms who have agreed to either keep markups at a specific level during the COVID-19 crisis or for a period after the crisis. This is in effect a form of price regulation. And is competition policy really the right instrument for this? And perhaps if I can just tack on a second question here for you to consider. As part of some of the research we're doing at CCRED on small businesses, we have heard about, we've heard concerns from them about the impact of the new regulations on their businesses. Has the Competition Commission developed any guidelines or safe harbors that can give firms a little bit more certainty during this time? As we've heard from Nicola, there are a lot of things to consider when these firms set their prices. Over to you, James.
Thanks, Reena. Maybe let me paint a little bit of context to what we're facing and the experience that we're having at the Commission, and hopefully answer the questions in the process. So since the regulations came into effect, consumers have become vigilant. I think consumers have become a little more astute and aware, and maybe historically South Africa has not had particularly active consumers, but that has certainly changed. What we are also seeing is that retail level, and whilst Massimo has talked about the sort of supply response, at a retail level they're not the supplier, they're not the manufacturer that needs to expand their output. Retailers are there reselling the product to the public. Massimo talked about potentially narrowing geographic markets, and that is certainly one factor. What we're also seeing is changes in consumer behavior. And that is another factor that needs to take into account. So it's not just about how far a different store is from another, and is my local store my captive store. It's also that consumers don't want to shop around. They don't want to expose themselves to multiple risks. And that is certainly some of the lessons coming through earlier, that in the past you may have shopped around and said, well, I think I can get this cheaper at a different store, I'll move on, and go to 4 or 5 shops. We're not seeing that now. I think people want to get in, get out. The same problem with scarcity. What is your consumer behavior under scarcity? I see it in the store. Do I say, well, let me shop around and come back here tomorrow? Or do you say, well, they've got it in stock, it's high priced, but I need it. And so you grab it. And so consumer behavior does change in a time of a crisis. So often we're focused on almost the supply side and the behavior of the sellers, but we also need to consider the behavior of consumers at the same time. I think the problem we're seeing across the board is that a retailer may at some point face an increase in the price of the product, but it's the margin that they add on to that product at the same time that also increases. And we're seeing everyone in the supply chain exploiting this position of shortage. And that is almost the problem, because the margin increases compound. So some people have said, you know, some of the margins we're chasing are not that large, or the increases are not that large. But if the importer doubles their margin, then the distributor doubles their margin, and then the retailer doubles their margin, the inflation through the chain is huge. And there's no reason that we see that a reseller, whether it's a distributor or importer or retailer, needs to increase their margins, even if the costs of many of these imported products are going up, such as face masks or hand sanitizer. There is an argument that says, you know, at a higher price, maybe you need more working capital. But equally, when your stock turns are much higher, in fact, just keeping the margin the same if the price increases tenfold or the cost increases tenfold, that in fact that margin, that self-same margin, may indeed be excessive, even at the kind of volumes and price levels that you're talking about. So I suppose the advice in many respects for firms at the retail and reseller level is the benchmark is your margin that existed prior to this crisis. That's the margin that was adequate to run your business, cover your overheads, etc. during this period. The exploitation we're seeing is the increase in that margins. There haven't been many supplier, as in manufacturer cases at the moment in South Africa. What we're also aware is that costs do go up. Now, face masks and hand sanitizer is one. And if the margin remains the same for the reseller, the importer, and the retailer, well, then that's a pass-through. I think we're acutely aware that now we're also getting to see some impacts in the food value chain as well. So internationally, for one, the rand has depreciated, which means certain imported products have gone up in price. But other countries are taking actions to protect their own consumers, such as export bans, which are driving increases in pricing in certain food commodity markets. So it's something we acknowledge and understand. It still doesn't give an excuse, though, for any sort of margin increase through the chain. So whilst there is a cost increase, what we are focused on probably most, at least with imported products and things that come through, is where do the margins change? We can see this as a form of price regulation, but it's not a hard price regulation. So it's not the price cap that Massimo has talked about in Italy. And in many respects, I would say it's a better or more flexible tool. Many products are imported. There are food commodities, as I indicated, that also go up in price. If margins stay constant through the chain, those cost increases, and that's the cost justification for the price increases, can be accommodated. The alternative, if this form sort of fails, is that you end up with a hard price cap regulation from a government. And that's probably a worse place to end up. So in many respects, the rules, I think, are simple. The assessment is relatively simple. It is a margin-focused business. through. There will be at some levels some marginal increases in costs over time, having some more safety and sanitizing in the stores. At the moment, those are probably trivial compared to the overall span of goods sold in those stores. But at a manufacturer level, those may rise over time. But I think that the sort of form of lockdown and keeping the food value chain at least open at the moment and essential goods, those haven't escalated too much. But the Commission is willing to always look at those costs, but they need to be substantiated. And I think that is probably the main problem we're seeing, is that firms that do want to exploit the situation use the environment and context to argue hypothetically prices or costs are going up and they've got certain costs, but use that as an excuse to push up prices. And they must understand you need to substantiate that. You can't be that we just accept that costs have changed. So maybe let me stop there as a sort of general introduction. I think maybe one thing to say is that whilst we start at the retail level, we are moving up the value chain very rapidly, because many retailers will say, well, the price of the face mask we got from this supplier went up. We'll go and ask that supplier why it went up. And that's why I say we are finding price gouging through the value chain. It's a cumulative problem, and one that it's a reason why we need to be very sensitive about it.
Great, thanks very much, James. I think some of the points that you've raised are very important, and they do give some certainty on the Commission's approach, particularly looking around changes in margins from the previous period, and that will be a key variable that the Commission assesses in these cases, and of course the need for any changes to be very well substantiated. So that's very useful. It's also interesting that you say that these cases are moving up the value chain, and I can imagine that the concepts and the kind of tests that need to be done are going to be more and more difficult as we move to production levels of various value chains, such as food. I think this would be a really good time to take some questions from the attendees. I would just like to share a screen with the attendees briefly. And this screen basically just has the name of all the panelists whom you already know by now. It also has our Twitter handle, the CRED Twitter handle at the bottom, as well as the hashtag we're using. If you want to continue these discussions on social media platforms, please feel free to do so with those Twitter handles and hashtags. So moving to the Q&A session, I'm not sure if I was cut off earlier on when I was sort of providing the rules of engagement. As I said, and I think the attendees have stuck to those instructions. There's many questions coming through the Q&A chat. There are some questions that are already upvoted, and just to remind you, if your question is the same as somebody else's that has already been written, please upvote that question so we don't have repetition. And I will read the questions out, even though everyone can't see it, and I will direct it to the respective panelists that are asked the question, and then I will ask the panelists to respond. I think we'll take 3 questions at a time, give the panelists a chance to respond, and panelists, please feel free, if there was a question that was not addressed directly to you, but you have some comments, please feel free to chip in there. Okay, I'm going to start with a question for Professor Massimo Motta. And the question is, what is the correct way to think about the counterfactual in a situation like COVID-19? Is the price outside of COVID-19, if the crisis was non-existent, or is it to ask what the outcomes would likely be under a situation of crisis if competition worked effectively? I'll leave it there because it's a rather long question, but I think the point is, how do we think about the counterfactual in such situations? There is a second question which is not directed to any of the panelists, And this is around, I'll read it out as it is. In the case of a production shift or entry of a new supplier of an essential good, as they were not in the market during March 2020, how will it be assessed whether the price these suppliers set are excessive? So this is asking about the situation when the competitive landscape changes to something that was not there prior to March 2020. And the last one I'll take in this round, again, this is not addressed to anyone in particular, and this is around the excessive pricing, or it asks the excessive pricing of essential goods, examples given, hand sanitizers, masks, etc., was used by some shops to prevent panic buying. And the question is, to what extent can this justify excessive pricing? So to what extent do shopkeepers charge higher prices to avoid panic buying? So I think let's pause there and let's put it to the panelists to answer these questions. Perhaps we can start with the first one to Prof. Motta around the counterfactual.
Thank you, Reena. Well, in the particular case of the South African regulation, the counterfactual has already been established by the regulation itself, in saying that the price, which is the benchmark to judge the excessive pricing, is the average price in the 3 months prior to the crisis. So in this particular case, at least it's the law itself which says what is this particular counterfactual. But you know, there are still some questions which should be asked. That is that price, the average price in the 3 months before, really the correct benchmark? Or there might be some reasons, some objective justifications for which, you know, which push you to think that actually should not be the right benchmark. Let me explain through an example. So I think as I said, the regulation is pretty clear. They say you should look at the price the 3 months before the crisis. But it is very well possible that there were some particular events in those 3 months which explains why the price was somehow an outlier. So in this particular case, I think it would be justified to take this into consideration and start to look at more months. So before it was, for instance, said, well, what if something happened during those 3 months? Well, I think in that particular case, the burden of proof should be on the firm to explain why in the 3 months at issue, there was some particular event which explains why you shouldn't take that price as the right counterfactual. But here I think that James reminded us of one important principle, that is that it's not enough for the firms just simply to claim some generic reasons why they might have charged a price which is lower than normal, but they should really substantiate their claims, and they should really, you know, explain data in hand why there are reasons, there are strong reasons to believe that in those 3 months the price was something which was not representative. I think I would stop here unless, Reena, I have the possibility to just say one thing, which is in response of what Nicola was mentioning before.
Yes, please, Massimo, go ahead.
So I think that Nicola raised a very interesting issue, which is the issue of market power. And I do agree that it is crucial to define the relevant market. So, but the only thing is that it might well be that in the context of these cases, you might define the markets, both geographically and temporary markets, in a different way than you would have defined the market a few months ago, for different reasons, because consumers are shopping a different way, because they cannot go around because of confinement, for instance. And so I think that these are all things that I think that the Competition Commission and the Competition Tribunal should look at. That is, you should indeed define the markets as we are used to do in competition cases. And again, you should go down to the details and look at the context and do the proper economic analysis to see in the particular case at hand whether the market should indeed define more broadly or more narrowly, etc. And it should also take into account all possible considerations, including, for instance, the fact that, yes, maybe consumers are not moving to another shop or to another supermarket, but they might have an option, which is to buy online. Now, all these are theoretical possibilities that might exist in principle, but then one has to look at the particular facts of the cases. In some places, online shopping might be a possibility. In some other places and other times, it might not be a possibility. So I think that it's really important to go down to the details. But I do think, and in this I completely agree with Nicola, that one should really go and do its homework in defining markets. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Massimo. I think let's just to remind the panelists of the second question again, it wasn't directed to anyone in particular, but it was around the case of production shifts or entry of a new supplier that were not in the was not part of the competitive landscape or part of the market during March 2020. And how will this situation be assessed, whether the price these suppliers set are excessive? So anyone who would like to answer that can take that question.
Reena, perhaps I can just also reply quickly to the counterfactual before we talk about entry.
Sure, let's do that. Go ahead, Nicola.
Yes, because I think that's exactly the question that we need to grapple with in these cases. So again, the question was the counterfactual, and we now understand the counterfactual legally, as Massimo pointed out, to be the 3 months. But interestingly enough, from a market definition perspective, you might very well find that where products aren't substitutes outside of the period, they might actually become substitutes within that crisis period. So one needs to, again, look at that specific issue and then think about the market definition in that case. The problem, and maybe we'll touch upon that later, but we are in these expedited timeframes. So together with the new regulations, we also have expedited timeframes, which gives the respondents, I think, 72 hours, for instance, to file their responding papers. And I'm worried that that actually gives very little time to really get to the bottom of cost issues, for instance, the specific facts of the case. And essentially what we are seeing is that these regulations are applied as a form of what we would see in America as price gouging, where you simply compare the price and the cost. Whereas, in fact, there are many factors listed in our Act. So one would, for instance, also need to think about the internal rate of return, return of capital, especially if you go up the supply chain, as James indicated. So I think it's quite difficult to cover all of this ground and to really work out what the counterfactual is, what the relevant market is, given these expedited timeframes. So I think that's an added dimension one needs to think about in our specific case.
Thanks, Nicola. If there are no other comments on the question of counterfactual, perhaps we can try and answer the question around what do you do if it's a firm that wasn't in the market prior to March 2020. I've got, James, would you like to say something? And then Massimo, after James, thank you.
Sorry, Reena, can I just be indulged quickly on this last issue Nicola raised? I think the cases we're faced with currently, quite frankly, are simple. It's it's retailers or resellers who've just upped their margins without any cost explanation. And that has always been a test that has been identified in Europe and our own appeal court, that in the context where a firm raises its prices without any cost changes, there's a question whether then that becomes excessive or not. And one may question around how much of a price increase, but that is an inquiry around costs. And what we are finding is that in the main part, retailers and resellers and distributors and importers cannot justify that cost increase. So they may point to, putting in a security guard here or there, but nothing that can explain the kind of margin increases that we see being pushed through. Yes, there may be more complex cases in future, and there is an investigation stage which has to deal with that complexity before it gets to a truncated hearing. And no doubt those will be more carefully traversed. But as I said, in most cases, these are not complex. Just in terms of what is excessive is if one hasn't supplied, and this has cropped up already. And in the retail and reseller world, what we are looking at is what are typical margins for these products in the periods prior to the COVID pandemic. Because obviously investigating many cases, one gets a good sense of what retailers, importers are doing in the normal course. And that database is being built, and we can start to look at what is the typical behavior in terms of margins and markups. And it will be a lot less at an importer level where there's just a warehouse and a quick throughput compared to a retailer where you may have bricks and mortar and staffing and other factors to cover. So there are benchmarks for this which we can use, and which provides some basis for assessing whether those markups are excessive or not.
Thank you, James. I think, Massimo, you wanted to add to that.
I wanted to give you a reply to the question of how you should assess a case of new entry. So the quick and somehow provocative reply is that I wouldn't assess it at all, in the sense that the problem that we have in situations of excess demand is that there is not enough production, and there is not enough supply. So if we have seen that there has been recent quick entry by a new company, that is something which is positive. So, it would be the last thing that I would do is to run an excessive price case against that company, because what has done is, to enter the market and thereby reducing the magnitude of the problem. Thank you.
Thanks, Massimo. There was one last question in that round of question, and it was with regards to increasing prices to reduce panic buying, and how would something like that be assessed? I'm not sure if any of the panelists would like to answer that. Go ahead, Pam.
Sure. I think the regulations are very much trying to deal with that issue precisely, because I think one of the rationales for price gouging regulations, as well as in the context of South Africa, implementing special regulations relating to excessive pricing around this, is to reduce product hoarding that would happen. So the analysis is pretty much the same, but I think the consideration is that there are other regulations in the South African case in section 6.1 of the same document that say precisely that there should be some sort of a rationing that happens of products. And we've seen in other countries like the UK, where supermarkets or retailers have committed to government that they are going to ration. Now, there are challenges that could happen here, whereas if you only allow people to buy 5 of any item, they can buy 5 and leave, and then come back and buy 5. And those are things that are very difficult to monitor and measure. But very much an important aspect of having the price regulation is to then have complementary provisions that deal with hoarding.
Thanks, Pam. We have a steady stream of questions coming in, but we won't be, as the attendees can imagine, we're not going to be able to go through all of them. But before I move on to the next few questions, I think, Massimo, you had raised your hand to make a point. Go ahead.
No, I wanted just to say that I agree with Pamela that you can reduce product hoarding in different ways, and I just want to report the experience that there have been in many countries where supermarket chains, for instance, have engaged in self-regulation. That is, they have, without having any government interventions, they have simply they simply decided to reduce the number of items that each consumer would buy. So I think that, if the supermarket says, well, I raised the price as a way of reducing product hoarding, there was another possibility, which was perhaps even much more direct, which was quite simply to limit the number of items that consumers could buy.
Thanks, Massimo.
Maybe, Reena, if I can just quickly add to that, I think that is the concern that's often expressed about using price to ration, which is that it's inequitable, because the wealthy can afford that surgical mask or hand sanitizer at an inflated price, but the poorer consumers cannot. And so the sort of equity of these measures is something that really comes into sharp focus during this period. And a lot has been said about the COVID crisis in South Africa and how it's almost demonstrated the inequities or exacerbated the inequities within the society, and the price gouging is exactly one sort. The panic buying we saw in that first week following the announcement, the big concern amongst, I think, government and the agencies, as well as some of the retailers, is people who are on a weekly wage who will only get to buy at the weekend. Well, the stock's gone by then. And so many of these measures, such as in the regulation to restrict the sale, are precisely designed to try and ensure an equitable distribution of what are essential products. And some of the big national chains have been very effective at that, in managing the stock and managing it between different locations as well, because you can imagine even geographically, if there's heightened demand in Sandton, for instance, for face masks or bread flour, which seems to be out of stock permanently, then stock will chase that demand and deplete in township areas. So equity is a big part of the discussion. And in South Africa, given that the Act has a purpose around bringing about a change in equity in society, that is another layer that needs to be looked at within even the excessive pricing debate.
Thanks, James. So the next question, I think I'm going to read out the question and then pass over to the panelists to answer it. I suspect more than one panelist might want to answer this question. And the question is, for companies that have fixed costs and suddenly have a reduced product range allowed because of the essential products specifications, an economic response is likely to be to raise prices on the allowed product ranges. And wouldn't this make price rises for stores with restricted ranges rational? So given the restrictions on what retailers are allowed to sell during this period, is it not rational for them to raise prices in order to cover fixed costs? So I won't take other questions now. I think I'll pass over to the panelists to answer that first. Any takers? James?
I'll have a go if you want. Maybe a couple of observations. I think a lot of costs have changed. Retailers aren't paying the rentals they used to. They don't necessarily employ the same staff that they used to. So by focusing in on one element, one may also be missing the bigger picture. You know, we've also seen in some industries a massive boost in sales through March as people did panic buy and stocked up, and that filtered up the supply chain as well. And there were benefits in that month that accrued, and then maybe some lower revenues in April. So I think one needs to be careful when looking at this and to look at it in the round as well. Because we know, as I said, for instance, that there are big debates going on about the payment of rent and rental holidays, and big retail chains who have leases based on turnover that have seen their so-called fixed costs not in fact remain constant but decrease over time. So it is a more complex picture, and that's maybe the point I just wanted to make.
Are there any other comments from the other panelists on this point?
The only comment I would make on that is that obviously would speak to your ability. So again, it has to speak to these essential products, but you know, it would require a fairly dynamic, quick response from these companies in markets where I can't immediately think that they would necessarily have the pricing power to do that. Of course, if they are able to do that and increase it to high prices, then that would trigger some investigation. But I think James is correct. One then has to look at the entire fixed cost over a period, not simply over a month, for instance, or a short period.
Thanks, Nicola. I see the next question names a specific firm, so I'm going to skip that. If I can just remind the attendees that, you know, we're not talking about specific firms or cases in this session, but rather broader principles around the topic. So I'll take the following questions, and this is addressed to James. And the question is, how does the Commission view demand as a driver of price increases in assessing these cases? So this one is for James.
I think as Massimo pointed out in his article last week or the week before, that in periods of excess demand and not necessarily a supply response in a disaster type context, those are precisely the sort of environment where market power can now accrue and where people can exploit that. So the retailer or reseller who has stock, knowing that others don't because there is a supply chain, is exactly in the position to increase their price. So that is, from our perspective, you know, indicative, if the margins are being pushed up, of a exploitation in this period, especially at a reseller level where this doesn't hold any benefits for investment in new capacity or supply. And that's where I think often the debate is sort of bifurcated. There's the manufacturer debate, and then there's the sort of retailer-reseller debate. And much of what we're seeing at the moment in South Africa is that the retailer-reseller is some of the essential health products are imported, and even some of the food commodity products are imported as well. I mean, maybe, Reena, just to also add to the debate, because Nicola made the interesting point, I thought at the beginning, is, you know, one may be trained in a particular environment, one writes guidelines for a particular environment. And what is interesting about now living through a disaster period is the observations one makes about behavior. And I think this is going to be a rich world for lessons and academic writings that come from it. But for that community, it is to understand how consumers behave, how firms behave. And it may be rational for a firm to think that, well, let me increase the price on this, but it may not be, from a policy perspective, equitable or fair. And so one also has to separate what is a natural, you know, for a monopoly, it's natural to raise price too. I think it is going to throw up many policy and interesting debates that we need to engage in, and we'll learn lessons through this about the economy, about the supply chains, and also about what might be those measures to differentiate one case from another. And that's why the more cases I think the tribunal hears and the debated, the better.
Thanks, James. The next question also seems to be for you, James. It is a bit of a long one, and maybe this is again a point where I would just ask the attendees to try and keep their questions a little briefer. But James, I think you also are able to see this question on your screen, but nonetheless, I'll read it out. And this question asks, once the demand shock abates, for example, a vaccine is discovered or mass produced, retailers of high volume COVID-related products like face masks are likely to make large losses on these products. This is because retailers are purchasing high volumes, paying higher than normal prices, and have to make commitments on orders given international demand for these products. With the end point of the demand shock being uncertain, there is a risk in any time period that orders placed in that time will be loss-making. Would retail margins not need to increase in order to compensate retailers for taking the risks that they will be stuck with high-cost inventories which they cannot move quickly post-demand shock?
Reena, I'm happy to answer, but I also think the other panelists must please jump in.
Yes, please feel free, other panel members, to step in.
I'm going to say one lesson I've learned as well from this process is the amount of speculation that happens as to what will happen. And it is an interesting element, and I raise this not to dismiss the question, but more what we are starting to see even, and this is more in the context, I would say, of supply relationships, is that firms are saying, well, I anticipate in the next 2 months X and Y, therefore I'm going to, drop my price to my supplier and tell them that they, in fact, I'm not going to pay them as much anymore. Or I anticipate I may incur some costs in starting up my factory with more health precautions. So there's a lot of speculation, anticipation, and uncertainty does add to the environment. I think it's unfortunate, though, that in some cases that uncertainty is used to almost try and rationalize or justify certain behavior. And where the Commission has pushed back on this is to say, well, what is the actual experience and can this be justified? So we've had firms in the lockdown period say, well, this is our experience, so we're going to impose costs on our suppliers for the post-lockdown. But that's a post-lockdown, it's a different environment. So we also need to be a little careful in this environment as to, I suppose, the forecasts. They vary wildly. And even in respect of this question, I don't think anyone thinks we're going to be living without this anytime soon. This is a long-term or medium-term event that I don't think we're going to see some shock that's going to leave firms with losses. But if a firm came to the Commission with that argument, I think we wouldn't necessarily entertain it at this stage. Thanks,
James. I see there is a similar question around, should there be pricing for this uncertainty? And I think James has addressed that. Perhaps maybe to give James a break and to field a question that is to Pamela and Nicola. And this is the question. So thought has been given in the UK to a combined competition and consumer law enforcement response, as well as advising government on emergency legislative options. I think it's right to say that recent regulations in South Africa facilitated the establishment of excessive pricing, although not amending the requirements to establish dominance. But I'm less clear on the interplay with consumer protection law element in South African regime. Any insights would be most welcome. In fact, this question can be taken by anyone on the panel, not necessarily just Pamela and Nicola. So this is around the interface of the competition regime and the consumer protection regime.
I'm happy to give it a shot, although it's obviously a legal question.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what one can say, obviously, is that the regs have those two lists of products, and one of them relate to the Competition Act and one of them actually relate to the Consumer Protection Act. So I think for us that operate mainly under the ambit of the Competition Act, one should be aware of that difference. And then of course, I think, you know, in any country you get regulatory shopping, and the upper limit of the fine under the Consumer Protection Act is also lower. So I think there's issues here around institutional capacity. The Commission has been quick to deal with these cases, but I agree in principle, it would sound like the Consumer Protection Act would be the way to go for unconscionable prices, but legally we now sit with this fact that it has been brought under excessive pricing. So that's the reality.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Nicola.
And oh, sorry, if I can just add to that, Reena, I think the kind of weight that's been placed more around the competition authorities is likely because the authorities have been in effect for a longer period of time, and the competition process allows for transparency, which I think is very important in dealing with these quite complex issues.
Reena, can I just jump in here, and I want to draw Massimo, you in as well. Massimo made a point at the beginning about other policies and supply response, not just prosecution. And I think what we are finding at this stage is that a competition agency or authority, and even a consumer agency, needs to also revisit its mandate in many respects, because I mentioned earlier that we see food commodity markets prices increasing. We know it's by factors beyond our control, but can there be ex ante active engagements to try and facilitate a market response that might alleviate some of the increases? And so I think what we are finding certainly is we're getting drawn into increasingly a number of these debates to try and almost make markets work better. One might see it almost as a form of market inquiry, but obviously it's truncated. And maybe if I can ask Massimo from his perspective as well, and seeing how the authorities are working in Europe, is there that shift in focus as well? It's not just about prosecution and implementations, how to facilitate the market at this stage as well.
So I think you raise a very interesting point. And I think indeed there is a room for competition agencies to do more than the prosecution of cases. And in particular, I would call it advocacy power to, in many jurisdictions, what happens is that competition authorities do have advocacy powers, do have advisory roles with respect, for instance, to law and regulations that governments might enact. So I think that what you're suggesting is something which I would agree with. That is that there are, there is a broader scope of intervention, at least intervention in a sense of intervening in the debate for the competition agencies, and especially so in a world like the one that we are seeing today, in which there is much more government intervention than there used to be. So, for instance, I think it's very important that competition agencies advise governments on, state aid interventions and subsidies and other instruments that governments might want to resort to, and try to do so to advise the government to do it in such a way as to be as least distortive as possible. And perhaps also competition agencies might also have a role to play in suggesting governments what could be ways in which government might actually deal with situations like the one that we are seeing in many countries, where we are in need for some interventions to increase supply, for instance. So yes, definitely.
Go ahead.
Can I also come in? Yeah, and I think this also brings another important debate, which is around whether competition policy and industrial policy should be in tension with each other or more complementary. And I think there's what's happening at the moment is really putting a strong case that it really should be complementary, and we should be thinking about, coordination of sectors, particularly in the type of market issues that you're highlighting, James, and the competition aspect. And you're seeing a bit of this both in South Africa and elsewhere in the world, where there are a lot of block exemptions to allow people to work together in order to achieve particular ends that are important for the economy. But and there's also, even in the economic literature, there have been a lot of papers that have come out in the last 2 months or so that are saying we really need to think about competition policy in a different way in a post-COVID world, which would be bringing the instruments of industrial policy and competition policy closer together.
Thank you, Pam. I am conscious of the time. We are 1 minute before 5:30. There are several other questions that are popping up on the screen, and I'm really sad that we can't deal with all these questions, but we are running out of time. I would perhaps maybe just give the panelists a last round if they want to say something that's been pressing, or if they've been reading some of the questions. They might have thought of something, but I think at this stage, we're not going to be able to take any more questions. Before I do that, though, I would like to just put out a poll, which will give the attendees a chance to provide some feedback on the session. So maybe while I'm doing that, the panelists can just think about last thoughts in order to wrap up the session. Thanks. So the poll should be up, and I asked the panelists to, not the panelists, oh, well, if the panelists want, they can too, but the attendees to just vote on the poll. And perhaps we can just have a quick round of kind of closing thoughts or comments from the panelists. There are, like I said, several questions, and we'll try and consolidate the questions we haven't had time to answer and use that for discussion going forward. So any last thoughts from the panelists? Massimo, go ahead.
Just one, which is that I think you raised at some point the issue of legal certainty for firms. So it's true that having expedited procedures, it might have some drawbacks in the sense that you cannot have the sort of very in-depth economic analysis that you might have in other situations. But at least what we are going to see is that the Competition Tribunal will immediately express its views in the next few cases about how we are going to enforce the regulations. And so through the precedents, firms should understand better the way in which these regulations will be enforced.
Thanks, Massimo.
I want to make a closing remark, which is not specific to excessive pricing, but it follows on from what Pam has just said in terms of thinking about industrial policy and competition policy and coordination between them. I would just like to say that what we really need in this time of crisis is policy coordination. So apart from the regulations about excessive pricing and consumer protection, we've also seen the exemptions, for instance, from the competition authorities. So those were very quick. It dealt with the healthcare sector, deals with banks, for instance, with retail property. But in this crisis, what would be paramount is cooperation between private and public sectors, also in healthcare sphere. And I think one should clear some of these stumbling blocks around exemption of thinking about prices and capacities together. Those aren't forthcoming from the ministers. So I think there's an whole issue here around policy coordination, and excessive pricing fits into that bigger debate. But I think the overall aim should be to get us through this crisis by coordinating policy in a way that is rational. And once one gets to all these post-COVID academic studies, one would at least be able to say that there was some rationality and coordination here. And I think that's paramount, and we should all try to work towards that.
Thanks, Nicola. You're on mute.
I think what would really be useful, and James has already started hinting at the kind of things that would be safe harbors, or where the Commission is not really worried about. If a public document would be available, so that there isn't as much concern about am I pricing excessively or not. So at least the Commission can also quite focus on the issues that are truly exploitative.
Thanks, Pam. James?
Maybe a last comment as an economist. I think this is an exciting time in the sense that it's a challenging time, and we can, I suppose, sometimes implement from a textbook or a case precedent in a sort of rote manner and reel those arguments out. But this really forces us to rethink and rethink the dynamics in an economy, rethink unintended or intended consequences. And so it is an exciting time. And I think we're going to learn a huge amount during this time, also about our economies as we dig deep into different value chains through these multiple investigations. So it's an opportunity as well as a disaster.
Thanks, James. Any other last thoughts? Massimo, I think you've had your last thoughts. Nothing else? Thank you. Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you for your participation. Panelists, you were great. You raised some really, really important issues, food for thought going forward. And attendees, thank you very much for your questions. And I am just going to end the poll so everyone can see the results of the poll. I hope everyone can see that screen. And thank you. Based on that, it seems like the session was very effective in addressing the topic of price regulation and excessive prices in times of crisis in South Africa. And with that, I think I'm left to just thank everybody once again for your participation. And I hope we can continue this engagement offline. And I wish everyone well. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening. Bye.